The town had gone quiet in a way that towns only go quiet when something is wrong, not the natural quiet of an empty afternoon, the other kind. Doors pulled shut, windows occupied by people standing back from the glass just far enough to watch without being seen watching. A blacksmith with a hammer, frozen mid-swing, letting the iron go cold against the anvil because the sound of hammering suddenly felt too loud, too present, too much like an announcement. A piano inside the saloon, stumbling on a chord and stopping. The street empty except for dust and wind and the particular quality of stillness that a community produces when it has learned, through long and painful experience, that certain moments require it to disappear. This is not a scene from a story. This is a real condition. It happened in towns across the American frontier, and the silence that produced it had a specific cause, the accumulated pressure of a community that had been frightened into quiet, and the specific question of whether anything could bring it back. Welcome to Shadow West. Tonight, we are going somewhere that doesn't get discussed enough in the history of the American frontier. We are going to talk about what happened to towns that lost control of themselves, communities that were squeezed and pressured and intimidated into a kind of collective paralysis, and what it actually took to come back from that. Because the real story of the frontier is not just the story of conquest and lawlessness. It is also the story of the communities that endured, that organized, that found their way back to something like functioning civil life through means that were rarely as clean or as fast as the stories suggest. Tonight, that is what we are going to explore. If you are new here, subscribe and stay a while. We tell real frontier history every week, going to the places and the subjects that the standard story tends to skip. If you have been with us before, thank you. Now, let's get into it. Because the story of how a frontier town loses itself and how it finds its way back is more complicated and more interesting than anything a movie has ever managed to capture. To understand what it meant for a frontier town to lose control of itself, you first have to understand how fragile the order in those towns actually was to begin with. A frontier town was not a settled community with generations of established institutions behind it. It was, in most cases, a recent creation, sometimes only a few years old, sometimes newer than that, built on a site that had been empty range or wilderness before the specific economic opportunity that created it. A mining strike, a railroad terminus, a cattle trail endpoint. Whatever the occasion, the town came first, and the institutions of civil society came after, slowly and incompletely. The marshal or sheriff who kept order in a frontier town was typically a single individual, perhaps with one or two deputies, responsible for maintaining public safety across a jurisdiction that could cover enormous distances and could include a population that, at peak seasons, was larger and more volatile than any one man or small team could reliably manage. The legal system that backed this individual up, the courts, the judges, the territorial or federal authority that gave local law enforcement its legitimacy, was geographically distant, slow to respond, and inconsistently effective when it did respond. Justice in a frontier town was, as a practical matter, largely local. What happened locally determined what the law actually was, for most purposes most of the time. This structure was not an accident or a failure. It was a reflection of the genuine difficulty of building civil institutions across a territory that was, by Eastern standards, impossibly large and impossibly sparse. The people who settled the frontier understood that the law they had was thin, and that the order it provided was contingent on enough people in the community choosing to support it. When that support held, the town functioned. when it was undermined, when enough of the people and institutions that gave local law its force were compromised, pressured, or simply frightened into compliance with a power that operated outside the law, the structure could collapse in ways that were surprisingly rapid and surprisingly complete. The mechanisms of this collapse were consistent across the communities where it occurred. It rarely started with open violence. Open violence attracted attention, created martyrs, unified opposition. The more effective approach was slower and more systematic. Economic pressure, applied through control of essential services. Legal pressure, applied through manipulation of the loan and property systems we discussed in an earlier episode. Social pressure, applied through the demonstration that certain people and their interests were beyond the reach of official consequences. Not a single dramatic event. A gradual process of demonstrating, transaction by transaction, incident by incident, that the formal structures of the community could be made to serve private interests rather than public ones. The people in these communities were not passive or foolish. They understood what was happening. The understanding, however, did not translate automatically into effective resistance, because resistance had costs that the individual members of the community were not equally positioned to bear. A merchant who spoke out against the dominant power in town risked losing credit at the bank that power controlled. A rancher who organized neighbors risked finding his fences cut and his cattle scattered. A deputy who tried to enforce the law impartially risked his position, his income, and potentially his safety. The calculation that each person made was rational given their individual circumstances, and the collective result of those rational individual calculations was a community that could not protect itself. Here is something worth thinking about. The people in these towns were not cowards. They were ordinary people doing the calculation that ordinary people do when the cost of action falls on the individual and the benefit of action is distributed across the community. If you had been a shopkeeper in a town under this kind of pressure, knowing what was happening, knowing it was wrong, knowing that speaking out might cost you everything, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments. I think honest answers to that question tell us something important about ourselves as well as about the frontier. The tools used to maintain control over a frightened frontier community were, like the tools of land fraud, primarily instruments of pressure rather than instruments of violence. Violence was present as a possibility, always present, always available, but the most effective control was exercised through mechanisms that kept the threat implicit rather than explicit, because explicit threats created legal exposure and unified opposition in ways that a consistent background of pressure and demonstrated consequence did not. The economic tools were the most fundamental. A man who controlled the grain mill in a farming community controlled a portion of every farmer's income. A man who controlled the feed store set the terms on which ranchers could maintain their livestock. A man with a share in the local bank, often held through a lawyer whose name appeared on the paperwork but whose decisions were made by someone else, had access to the financial details of every business in town and the ability to affect credit decisions in ways that were technically legal and practically devastating. These were not coincidental accumulations of economic power. They were deliberate strategies for creating a web of dependencies that made resistance costly for anyone embedded in the local economy. The legal tools operated through the manipulation of the same systems we discussed in the context of land fraud, but applied more broadly. Loans with buried clauses that could be triggered by technical defaults. property claims that appeared in the county records and created legal uncertainty about land that families had occupied for years. Nuisance litigation filed against businesses that were not cooperating, not with any expectation of winning, but with the understanding that litigation costs money and time and energy that the target might not have available. The legal system of the frontier was not reliable enough to protect ordinary people from this kind of sustained legal pressure, and the people applying it knew that. The gap between what the law was supposed to do and what it actually did in practice was the space in which this kind of power operated. The social tools were subtler but not less important. A community where certain subjects could not be discussed openly, where asking the wrong question or saying the wrong thing in front of the wrong person had consequences, was a community in which the mechanisms of self-governance could not function. Town meetings where the agenda was controlled by interested parties, local newspapers that reported what they were permitted to report, and nothing more, because the alternative was loss of advertising, loss of printing contracts, or simple physical intimidation. The informal conversations in which neighbors might have organized resistance were suppressed by the knowledge that those conversations were not private in a community where certain people's interests included knowing what everyone was saying. The relationship between a dominant power in a frontier town and the official law enforcement of that town was one of the most important determinants of whether the situation could persist or would eventually break. A marshal or sheriff who had been compromised through bribery, through dependence on the dominant power for political support, through simple fear for their own safety and their family's safety, was an instrument of the very control they were supposed to counter. A law enforcement officer in this position was not necessarily a bad person. They were a person who had made a calculation about what their situation permitted, and they had concluded that the calculation did not permit effective opposition. The people of the town understood this. The understanding did not make it easier to live with. When the situation in a captured frontier town eventually changed, and in many cases it did over time, through mechanisms that were rarely as dramatic as the mythology suggests, the change almost always involved the intersection of three things: documentation, external authority, and the willingness of at least some people inside the community to bear the personal cost of being part of a change that was going to be messy and slow and uncertain. The documentation came first, and it is worth dwelling on this because it is the part of the story that gets left out most consistently. The image of justice arriving on the frontier is almost always an image of action, a gunfight, a confrontation, a single decisive moment. The reality was different. The cases that resulted in actual, lasting change almost always had behind them months or years of patient, meticulous record-keeping by people who understood that the legal case had to be built before it could be used. Payment records, incident logs, dates, and names and amounts. Correspondence that documented what had been demanded and what had been threatened. The kind of evidence that turns a community's experience of injustice from a collection of personal grievances into a legal case that an outside authority can act on. The people who kept these records were operating in conditions of real risk. The dominant powers in these towns were not unaware of the danger that documentation posed to them, and they were not passive about addressing that danger. Records were destroyed. People who kept records were pressured. The risk of keeping careful documentation in a community where the person you were documenting had men whose job was to manage exactly this kind of threat was not a theoretical risk. It was something people had to calculate clearly and decide they were willing to accept. The fact that some of them did accept it that ordinary people in difficult circumstances chose to do the patient, unglamorous, dangerous work of writing things down is the part of the frontier story that deserves more recognition than it gets. The external authority that these documented cases eventually reached was, when it was the federal government, more effective than local or territorial authority for the reasons we have discussed. Federal jurisdiction was less susceptible to the local capture that made county-level justice unreliable. Federal agents and federal marshals operated outside the web of local dependencies that compromised local officials, and federal cases, when they reached federal courts, were evaluated by judges whose positions did not depend on the goodwill of the people they were judging. Getting from the documentation to the federal authority required a pathway, and in many frontier communities that pathway was not obvious or accessible. The telegraph helped enormously. The ability to reach federal offices quickly, to report situations that required outside attention before the inside situation had fully resolved, was a genuine change in the practical options available to people in trouble. The railroad, similarly, reduced the isolation that had made frontier communities so vulnerable by making it possible for federal agents to arrive in days rather than weeks, and for cases to be heard in courts that were geographically closer than they had previously been. The gradual development of communications and transportation infrastructure across the frontier was not just an economic development, it was a change in the balance of power between the people who exploited frontier isolation and the people who were subject to it. The willingness of at least some people inside the community to bear personal cost was the third essential element, and it was the one that no amount of documentation or external authority could substitute for. A federal agent arriving in a town that had been captured by a dominant power needed people inside the town who were willing to speak, to testify, to provide the human context that the documents alone could not supply. These people knew what they were risking. They had been living inside the situation that was being challenged. They understood better than anyone the specific consequences of being identified as someone who had cooperated with the outside authority. And in many cases, they did it anyway. Not heroically, or not in the dramatic sense, but in the grinding, costly, brave sense of people who had decided that the alternative was worse. To understand the specific dynamics of the cattle town, the kind of frontier community that became the symbolic center of the Western mythology, you have to understand the economics that created them and the specific pressures those economics generated. The cattle drives that moved millions of longhorn cattle from Texas to the railheads in Kansas and the northern territories between the late 1860s and the mid-1880s were one of the largest logistical enterprises in 19th century American history. The drives were organized by ranchers and cattle companies in Texas, managed by trail bosses and crews of cowboys, and sustained over journeys of hundreds to more than 1,000 miles through terrain that included flooded rivers, drought-stricken plains, hostile territory, and the constant attrition of weather, animals, and human endurance. The cattle that arrived at the railheads in Abilene or Dodge City or Caldwell represented enormous investment and enormous risk, and the men who arrived with them had, in most cases, been on the trail for weeks or months, operating under conditions of sustained physical hardship and sustained psychological pressure. The cattle towns existed to absorb this energy and convert it into commerce. The stockyards bought the cattle. The saloons and gambling halls and hotels and brothels bought the men's wages and their time, and the accumulated need for release that weeks on the trail had produced. The merchants sold supplies for the return journey. The banks moved the money. For the people who ran these businesses, trail season was the economic event that determined whether the year was profitable or not, and the management of the chaos that trail season brought was a perpetual challenge that the towns addressed with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of official willingness to impose order. The cowboys themselves were a population that the mythology has both romanticized and simplified. They were, in their actual composition, extraordinarily diverse. A significant percentage were black men, veterans of the Civil War, or simply people who had found in the cattle industry one of the few post-war economic opportunities that did not depend on race in the direct way that most occupations of the period did. Hispanic cowboys brought to the trade the horsemanship and cattle handling techniques that the industry was built on. Native men worked the drives in numbers that the mythology has mostly erased. The image of the cattle drive as an enterprise of white men is an image produced by the mythology, not by the historical record. The wages these men earned were modest by any standard, typically $1 to $2 a day for the duration of the drive, paid at the end in a lump sum that represented the accumulated earnings of weeks of work in conditions that were genuinely brutal. What they did with those wages in the cattle towns at the end of the drive was, for the merchants and saloon operators and gambling establishments who received them, a matter of significant commercial importance, and the measures taken to ensure that the money flowed in the desired directions, and to manage the behavior of men who had been cooped up and under pressure for weeks were a constant negotiation between the town's need for order and its need for the commerce that disorder generated. The strict social hierarchies that operated in these towns, who was welcome, in which establishments, who was served and who was turned away, who was protected by the informal structures of community and who was not, were not merely expressions of the prejudices of the era, though they were that. They were also instruments of economic and social control, mechanisms for directing the flow of money and managing the behavior of a transient population in ways that served the interests of the permanent population. Understanding this does not excuse what those hierarchies meant for the people who were excluded and harmed by them, but it helps explain their persistence and their specific forms in the context of the cattle town economy. Here is something the mythology almost entirely ignores. The violence of the cattle towns, the shootings and the fights and the confrontations that the Western story has made into its primary subject was, by the careful accounting of historians who have studied the actual records, far less common than the legend suggests. The frontier towns that became famous for violence were famous partly because violence happened there and was documented and reported, and partly because the mythology attached itself to those places and accumulated there over time, regardless of what the actual statistics showed. The average cowboy arriving at a cattle town at the end of a drive was not looking for a fight. He was looking for a drink, a meal, a bed, and a few days of not being on the trail. The fights and shootings that did occur were real and were sometimes lethal. But they were not the dominant feature of life in these towns, and the dominant feature, the commercial exchange that was the whole reason the town existed, has been mostly left out of the story in favor of the more dramatic but less representative violence. The frontier town marshal has been turned by the mythology into one of the iconic figures of American popular culture, the lone lawman facing down evil with a clear moral vision and a steady hand. The reality of what frontier marshals actually were and what their jobs actually required is more interesting, more ambiguous, and more instructive than the myth. The marshal of a frontier town was, first and foremost, a practical problem solver operating in a specific economic and social environment with limited resources and significant constraints. The primary function of the marshal was not to represent abstract justice. It was to maintain enough public order for the town's economic activities to continue functioning. The merchants and business owners who depended on the town's commerce were the effective constituency of the marshal, and they evaluated his performance in terms of whether the town was orderly enough for business rather than in terms of whether justice was being done in any broader sense. This meant that the marshal's priorities were shaped by practical commercial considerations in ways that the mythology entirely ignores. Managing the cowboys during trail season meant keeping them spending money without letting them do enough damage to drive away the merchants and the other paying customers. Maintaining order in the saloons and gambling halls meant ensuring that violence was limited enough not to disrupt the trade those establishments depended on, not necessarily ensuring that the trade itself was conducted honestly. The cheating at cards that was endemic to frontier gambling establishments was not typically the marshal's problem, because the people being cheated were transient and the establishments were permanent, and the permanent establishments were the ones that paid taxes and contributed to the political support that kept the marshal employed. The men who served as frontier marshals were, as we have discussed in previous episodes, typically people with complicated histories. Some had been on the other side of the law at various points. Some were operating in a gray area that moved depending on which town they were in and what that town needed. The qualities that made someone effective as a frontier marshal: the ability to read a volatile situation and intervene at the right moment in the right way, the credibility that comes from being someone others know to be capable of serious action if necessary, the patience and the judgment to know when not to act, were qualities that came from experience that did not always come from respectable sources. The marshal's relationship with the federal law was important and was, in many frontier towns, more complicated than it appeared. Federal authority and local authority operated in separate jurisdictions with separate mandates, and the interaction between them was sometimes cooperative and sometimes anything but. A federal marshal operating in a county town where the local marshal had been compromised was not automatically in a position to supersede local authority. Jurisdiction mattered. The specific legal basis for federal versus local authority over specific types of cases was contested and inconsistent, and the operators who worked within this complexity were often better versed in it than the people trying to use federal authority against them. The deputy, the person working under the marshal, often young, often inexperienced, often learning the job in real time, in conditions that did not allow for learning slowly, was a figure whose importance is consistently underestimated. The marshal was one person. A territory was large. The deputy was the mechanism by which the marshal extended his reach, and the quality of that extension depended entirely on the quality of the person doing the extending. A good deputy, one who could be trusted to exercise judgment independently, to represent the law credibly in situations where the marshal was not present, to maintain the appropriate relationships with the community without being captured by any particular interest within it, was worth more than the official record of the frontier ever adequately recognized. When a frontier town that had been captured by a dominant private interest began the process of recovering its function as a civil community, the process was almost never clean or fast. The mythology of the frontier tends to produce stories in which a single decisive event, the confrontation, the trial, the departure of the villain, resolves the situation and the community heals. The reality involved years of messy, contentious, imperfect work that did not lend itself to storytelling of the dramatic kind. The legal proceedings that followed the exposure of a fraudulent land or business operation could take years. The documentary record that had been built over months of careful record-keeping was not automatically sufficient to produce quick legal outcomes. The opposing legal teams that well-resourced defendants could field were skilled at procedural delay, at challenging the admissibility of evidence, at finding grounds for appeal, at exploiting every inconsistency in the documentation that had been assembled against them. The families and communities that had been harmed had to maintain their legal efforts and their financial capacity to pursue it through this extended process, which was itself an act of sustained determination that the mythology doesn't credit adequately. The community members who had cooperated with the dominant power during the period of control faced a complicated social reckoning when that control ended. The county recorder who had signed fraudulent documents, the bank employees who had implemented the manipulated loan terms, the minor officials and functionaries whose cooperation had been essential to the operation, these people were members of the same community that had been harmed by the operation they had participated in. The question of what accountability they owed and what the community was willing to extend in the way of understanding for their situation was not a question that resolved itself simply or quickly. Some people in these situations were genuinely coerced. They had cooperated because they had no real choice and understood clearly what would happen to them and their families if they refused. Others had been more fully voluntary participants who had received direct material benefits from their cooperation. The distinction mattered morally, but in practical terms, the community often had to make pragmatic decisions about where to invest its limited capacity for accountability and where to extend something that functioned as forgiveness, however imperfectly, in the interest of being able to function together going forward. These were not comfortable decisions, and they did not always produce comfortable outcomes. The economic recovery of a community that had been systematically drained by a fraudulent operation was also slower than the legal resolution. The land might be restored by court order, but the land that had been neglected or stripped during the period of control needed to be worked back to productivity. The businesses that had been forced out of operation or squeezed into dysfunction needed to be rebuilt, often by people who had lost capital and relationships and years of market position during the period of damage. The community relationships that had been strained by the division between those who had cooperated with the dominant power and those who had resisted it took time to repair, and sometimes did not fully repair within a generation. What did persist in communities that successfully went through this process was something harder to measure but genuinely important. A community that had been through this kind of extended ordeal and had come out the other side with its basic institutions intact had, in a very real sense, earned its understanding of what those institutions were actually for. The people in such a community were not naive about the gap between what the law promised and what it delivered. They had lived in that gap, documented it, fought in it, and found their way to something better through sustained effort rather than through any automatic working of a system that was supposed to protect them. That knowledge, earned the hard way, paid for in real cost, was the foundation of the political organizing that drove the reform movements of the later frontier period. The people who built the Farmers' Alliance and the populist movement of the 1880s and 90s were, in large numbers, people and descendants of people who had direct experience of what the frontier systems of land and finance could do when they were operating against ordinary families rather than for them. They were not idealists. They were people who had seen exactly how the machinery worked and were determined to change the specifications. One of the least told parts of the frontier story is the story of what the children who grew up in these communities inherited. Not materially, although the material inheritance, or lack of it, was real and significant. The psychological and social inheritance, the specific way of seeing the world that a childhood spent in a community under pressure, or in a family that had lost everything to a system it could not fight effectively, produced in the people who were formed by it. The children who watched their parents navigate these situations absorbed lessons that were not explicitly taught, but were transmitted in the way children absorb everything, through observation, through the emotional atmosphere of the household, through the specific experiences of their own lives in the communities where they grew up. They learned the precise difference between the way the law was supposed to work and the way it actually worked. They learned the specific cost of speaking when speaking was dangerous. They learned what it meant to be excluded from the protections that the community nominally extended to everyone, but actually extended only to some. And they learned, in many cases, that the people most responsible for the harm done to their families were not the outlaws or the violent men of the frontier mythology, but the men in good suits with good lawyers and good connections to the county courthouse. Some of these children grew up angry in ways that became destructive. The specific anger of people who have seen this system fail people they love, applied without adequate direction or outlet, produced some of the social disruption that characterized the later frontier period. The young men who turned to the kind of violence and lawlessness that the mythology celebrates were, in many cases, people whose relationship with legitimate social institutions had been poisoned by exactly the kind of systematic failure we have been discussing. The mythology made them heroes. The reality was that they were often the product of systems that had failed them, choosing the only form of power available to people who had been excluded from everything else. Other children channeled the same anger into the patient, grinding work of institutional change. The people who became organizers, reformers, lawyers, politicians working from within the system to change the specific mechanisms that had allowed the abuses of the frontier period. Many of them were carrying exactly this kind of inherited experience. They understood the problem from the inside. They knew which specific levers needed to be moved. They had the particular motivation of people whose families had paid the direct cost of the problem they were working to solve. The women in these families deserve specific mention for the same reasons we discussed in the context of documentation and record keeping. The mythology of the frontier has largely written women into secondary roles in stories that were primarily about men. The reality was that women in frontier communities were essential participants in every aspect of life, including the aspects that the mythology has most thoroughly overlooked. They maintained the records. They ran the economic administration of households and farms. They organized the social networks through which information and mutual support traveled. They made the decisions in many families that determined whether the family stayed or went, fought or accommodated, persisted or gave up. The daughters of frontier families who had been through these experiences were, in many cases, extraordinarily competent people. They had managed difficult situations from young ages. They had learned practical skills, legal, financial, organizational, that their circumstances required, regardless of the social conventions that were supposed to limit women's engagement with these areas of life. The frontier, for all its violence and all its injustice toward women, produced in some women a kind of practical capability that is genuinely remarkable and genuinely underrepresented in the historical record. The frontier is over. The specific conditions that produced the towns and the pressures and the struggles we have been discussing tonight ceased to exist as the West was incorporated into the settled, regulated, institutionally developed society that the American nation became in the 20th century. The land records were cleaned up, more or less. The banking system was regulated, more or less. The legal system became more consistently accessible to ordinary people, more or less. The more or less matters. But the trajectory was real. What persists is the legacy. And the legacy has two forms that coexist without resolving into each other. The first is the mythology, the Western story, the lone hero, the clean moral confrontation, the single decisive moment. This mythology is not simply false, it contains real things. The courage that the frontier required, the genuine heroism of people who faced genuine danger, the moral seriousness of communities trying to build something worth having in difficult conditions. The mythology simplified and romanticized these things, but it was not invented entirely from nothing. The second form of the legacy is the actual history, the land records and the court files and the testimonies of the people who lived through the specific experiences that the mythology summarized and simplified. This history is harder to hold because it contains contradictions that the mythology resolved by removing. The law was both the protection of communities and the instrument of their exploitation. The men who maintained order were both courageous public servants and people with complicated histories who had made calculations that did not always prioritize the public interest. The communities that survived were neither simply victims nor simply heroes. They were collections of ordinary people doing ordinary calculations in extraordinary conditions, and their outcomes reflected the quality of those calculations across hundreds of individual decisions made over years. The specific question that the frontier story poses, what does a community do when the official structures of protection and justice fail it, is not a historical question. It is a perennial one. Communities in different places and different times have faced versions of this question in ways that rhyme closely with what we have been discussing tonight, even though the specific instruments and the specific settings are completely different. The lesson that the frontier offers is not a simple one. It is not that guns resolve these situations, because the historical evidence is that they rarely did. And when they did, they resolved the acute crisis without resolving the underlying conditions. The lesson is more about documentation and patience and the willingness to use the right tools in the right sequence, and the importance of getting the information to the right authority, and the cost that ordinary people bear when they choose to bear it rather than accommodate. None of that is as dramatic as a gunfight. None of it makes for the kind of story that sells easily or that holds an audience with the simple satisfaction of a decisive moment. The history of how frontier communities actually preserved and recovered themselves is a story about sustained, unglamorous, costly effort by people whose names are mostly not remembered. The mythology remembered the men who stood in the streets. The history is full of the people who kept records at kitchen tables by lamplight, who rode long distances to reach federal authorities, who testified when testifying was dangerous, who stayed and rebuilt when leaving would have been easier. Those people deserve to be part of the story we tell about the American frontier, not instead of the mythology alongside it, because the mythology by itself gives us a story in which single decisive moments solve complex problems, in which individual heroism substitutes for institutional integrity, in which justice arrives on a horse rather than in a document. And that story, however satisfying, does not prepare us well for the real world, which tends to work more like the history and less like the legend. The history, taken seriously, tells us something more useful, that communities under pressure can recover, that ordinary people can bear extraordinary costs in the service of something larger than themselves, that the most powerful weapons available in most situations are patience and documentation and the willingness to use the right channels persistently over time. That is not a romantic story, but it is a true one, and truth is worth more than romance in the long run, in the same way that a solid building is worth more than a beautiful facade. The frontier towns that recovered did so because someone decided to start writing things down. Remember that. Before you go, I want to ask you something directly. We have spent tonight looking at communities under pressure, at how they lost themselves, and how some of them found their way back. What do you think the most important quality was in the individual people who made a difference, that allowed that recovery to happen? Was it courage, patience, the specific willingness to bear personal cost for a collective benefit? Something else? Leave your answer in the comments. Every response gives me something to think about, and I genuinely read them. If tonight gave you something real, leave a like on the video. It tells us to keep making history like this, and it means more than you know. Subscribe to Shadow West if you have not already, and share this with someone who thinks the Western story is only about gunfights. The real story is more complicated, more interesting, and more worth knowing. We will be back next week with another journey into the actual frontier, the one made of records and decisions and the quiet, costly courage of ordinary people doing necessary things. Until then, take care. And remember, the most powerful thing on the frontier was never the fastest draw. It was the person who kept writing things down.